last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as
Thanks,
simple as
Ryan.
1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
Well, hello there, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, well-being expert and wellness coach, Darlene Marshall. And it's probably no big surprise to hear me say that life gets complicated sometimes. I feel like right now, my social media feeds are people just kind of vaguely gesturing to the sky, like context, things moreover, so right now. And unfortunately for all of us, over these last 5 years, buzzwords like resilience and self-care and even wellness have become so buzzy. They get thrown around so much as to become kind of meaningless. I can remember, I've talked about this on the show before, my favorite example of wellness becoming meaningless was the advent of a wellness eye exam at the optometrist in the neighborhood in Brooklyn I used to live in. Because when we throw these words out all the time, they eventually just get stripped of their content and their context. They become kind of hollow and empty. And it's very frustrating for those of us who work in the nuance, who work in the depth of it, because resilience actually has a deep and essential foundation that's going to become very important in the context of today's episode. Resilience is our ability to stay regulated even when we are coping, dealing with, moving through something difficult. A person is resilient not because they're not dealing with anything, it's because there is a challenge and they're able to navigate it without losing themselves. And so the resilient person is the one who continues to handle themselves and get on with what needs doing, even when life is inevitably messy. And let's face it, life is inevitably a bit messy. So resilience and all of the stuff that comes with it is a really important set of skills. And one big component of resilience is how we handle stress itself within ourselves. And I'm going to own up front here. That is not the only component. And it's one of my pet peeves on the social media stuff when it comes to resilience, the way in which it gets talked about like, oh, resilience, you just do this and this and this inside of you. That's not how resilience works. That is not how toughness works. That is not how managing stress works. It is pretty frustrating to see it because in the research, the most resilient people have supported friends, networked resources, right? Like your parents have money they can lend you. Your friends come over and help you cook. And there's also institutional support. So whether that's a religious institution, a community organization, a stable government, any of that stuff, the research is very clear that increases resilience, our ability to tolerate stress, cope with challenge. When we are part of positive institutions, we have good relationships and we have networked resources. And none of that stuff has anything to do with like bootstrapping yourself through the worst of it. And also, what we do inside of ourselves with stress is also extraordinarily relevant. So today I want to talk about what that kind of self-work looks like when you're going through something difficult, what it looks like when it's effective and helpful and moves us through in an adaptive way, and what does it look like when not so much, and why is it also okay if it's also the not so much, right? Like no judgment here. If you're a fan of the show, you know, we're not here to pass a judgment. We're here to help the best we can. And we're going to start with straight from my favorite workshop to teach, my most popular workshop that I teach. If you don't know, I teach a lot of corporate wellness content. I've had 6 workshops in the last calendar week as I'm recording this. And of those 6 workshops, 5 of them were on self-care. So that workshop being Self-Care 101, I teach 2 core sets of skills in that workshop. The first is what I call proactive self-care. That is building systems into your life that keep your foundational human needs met so that you can remain high performing based on the idea that our physical bodies allow us to show up in the world and like enact our will upon our environment. And if you neglect your physical self, you become less and less effective, and therefore you have like less and less scope of impact and control. So we want to have proactive systems in place that keep us high functioning. That's your baseline. And then the second set of skills, the one that we're going to be talking about mostly today, is reactive self-care. Something comes along, it upsets your apple cart. Your apple cart's on the side. Maybe the axle is smashed. Your apples are rolling down the street. Do you know how to get the apple cart back on its wheels and continue on your day? That's reactive self-care. How do we handle when things are difficult, when things are dysregulated, when you are stressed out, when you're overstimulated, to re-regulate so that you can remain high functioning? That's the game plan here. That's where we're going to get weeds on. So today we're in that category of reactive self-care. We're going to be looking at these 2 core concepts of coping and numbing. And how do we know the difference and which is more effective and when and why, and the self-awareness involved? We got so much to play with today. So coping is all of the ways that we help ourselves to handle something difficult. Management of whatever that is. So these are the tools, the strategies, the processes to buffer, or what my therapist calls metabolizing, our unpleasant emotions. I've been using this phrase so much lately of like, it's not just that those emotions exist, but do we allow them to move through us and then inform us, reintegrate it, just like your metabolism. You take in food, you break it down, and then you use it in your body. How we move through that. So this might be conscious, like, okay, I am choosing to, I've been making a lot of craft projects lately. It's so funny. I was just joking with our producer, Eric, that like art imitating life, when you're going through stuff yourself, of course, it's going to show up in the show. So conscious coping. I've been knitting. I'm making a baby blanket for a friend's kid right now. I started embroidering a jacket, right? Like that's conscious coping. I'm choosing it. There's also unconscious coping. They're the things that you just do and you don't necessarily think about it. And some of that is habit or something you were taught that you just never really thought about or processed. That's unconscious coping. So we have conscious, we have unconscious. It might be individual coping. You hear introverts talk about this all the time of like withdrawing, but it also could be journaling. It could be how whatever you do when you are with you alone. And it could also be in community. It can be getting together with your friends, hanging out with your family, going for a walk, talking to your therapist, right? So coping can be unconscious or conscious. It can be individual. It can be in community. It can be thought or action. Sometimes our coping strategies are internal. There are thought techniques. Maybe it's even like a cognitive behavioral technique, a reframe, a strategy, or behavioral. Go for a walk. Knit your friend a baby blanket. So conscious, unconscious, individual, community, thought, behavior, all of these different categories can be ways that we cope to help buffer our stress, to help move through the difficult things, to help metabolize emotions involved. So that's coping. But this episode's not just coping. It's also about numbing. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and today we're going coping or numbing. We kind of set the table for coping. Numbing is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as, quote, depriving one of feeling or responsiveness, end quote. So this is dissociating. This is not dealing with what's happening. This is unfeeling. This is unplugging from your reality so that you just don't feel anymore. Now, the problem with numbing in the long term is that if you're not feeling the negative things, you also can't feel the good things as well. Because numbing is numbing is numbing. It's hitting the off button. And if you listen to the show before, you've heard me talk about, emotions are many things. One of the things that emotion are is information from our nervous system. And if we hit that numbing point, we also lose the information from our nervous system about the good stuff, because you're just, boop, we are unplugging from what's going on under the hood. So coping is feeling it and moving through it. Numbing is the emotional equivalent of like Novocaine for what's going on with you. So I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about some of the difficult things that have happened in your life. And then I want you to think about, what are some of the things that you did in those moments? How did you handle it? And when I ask this question in my workshops, I get a wide variety of answers. Things, we'll start off with things like, I go for a walk, I call my mom, I work out. And then typically I let those go for a second and then I'll be like, okay, great, I'm proud of you. Everyone always wants to tell me the virtuous things because they're like, oh yeah, personal trainer, wellness coach, positive psychology. Yeah. These are all the good things I do. And I'm like, but I bet that's not all you do if the day was bad enough. And then we start getting the real. So eventually someone will say, well, I have a drink. Okay. A drink, I will ask. A drink, or do you have one of those like fish bowls of wine that's on a stem and takes like half the bottle? And everybody laughs. Okay, fine. Where do you take that drink? You're not sipping it at the counter. You're going to take it to the couch, and you're not going to eat it with like the biggest salad you've ever had. You're probably going to get takeout. So you got your fish bowl of wine on the couch with your takeout. Binge watching Bridgerton for the 18th time, or whatever your weapon of choice is. Currently, my comfort television has been rewatching The X-Files and True Blood. And the other big one that's been coming up lately is like doom scrolling on your phone, which I recently read the statistic. Americans scroll 300 feet per day on average, which is the height of the Statue of Liberty. That is wild to me. Or compulsively shopping on your phone. The favorite answer I have ever gotten in that workshop, I love this. A woman said, I have mozzarella sticks in the bathtub. Now, she later corrected me and said, I don't do it together. I have mozzarella sticks and I take a bath. But mozzarella sticks in the bathtub has stuck in my head and I refuse to change it. Otherwise, that woman is my hero. So regardless of whether it's going for walks or it's fish bowls of wine and mozzarella sticks in the bathtub, I am not demonizing any of this. And I am not even saying that numbing is always bad. You'll hear a story about that in a second. It doesn't even necessarily have to be numbing by the same action. Okay, that's going to be a little confusing. So let me break it down. I might choose to have a glass of wine and be mindful with it and savor it and find pleasure in it as a coping of like, oh, this is delicious. This is good. This is regulating. I enjoy this. That's not numbing because I'm feeling something. And I could also mindlessly pound a glass of cheap wine to try to dissociate from my life. That's what I mean by numbing. And the question is, regardless of what action you are taking, just to ask yourself, am I using this to unplug, or am I using this to move through something difficult that I'm having a hard time processing? So let's play it out. Let's say you're in that second group. Let's say you're mozzarella sticks and fish bowls of wine in the bathtub. Something rough happens, and not like your life is totally crashing down around you. I'm going to leave that extreme to your therapist, right? Because there is a threshold where this isn't well-being. This is clinical. We want to recognize that. But you have something legitimately stressful going on in your life, and now you are in this moment of, how do I handle myself day to day? Fishbowl of wine, greasy takeout, it's a gut killer. Binge watching Bridgerton, you stay up too late, not crazy late, right? Because we're not going all the way down the rabbit hole deep end, but late. You're on screens, you're overstimulated. Maybe you're doom scrolling, maybe you're buying stuff you don't need. And you've overstimulated your nervous system a bit. You don't feel great. Alcohol or THC, depending on what state you're in, blocks deep phase sleep. So even if you're a person that says, well, when I'm stressed out, I need that drink or I can't fall asleep. Okay, technically you are asleep, but you're in light phase sleep. You can't get into the deep restorative sleep that your brain and your body need because you've been blocking that with those substances. That's going to compromise your sleep quality. So then you wake up the next day, you've blown your money on some like compulsive buying. You had worse sleep, you're tired, you're hungover, your stomach hurts. The apple cart isn't on the wheels then, right? Our effective reactive self-care is what brings us back into equilibrium, back into regulation, so that we're more resilient to handle the problem that we're actually facing. So instead, you stepped on all your apples in your apple cart and you're less effective at the things you actually care about. Not very helpful if resilience is the goal. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. Coping or numbing? You decide. Resilience is not always the goal. And this is where the nuance comes in. This is where that intro where I was like, man, I hate the way people talk about this stuff on the internet. And as a person who talks about this stuff on the internet, don't only listen to the first bit. Let's get into the real. You know, I love nuance. So this question to me of coping and numbing, whenever I think about it, and whenever even I'm teaching this workshop and this question comes up, I cannot help but think about back in 2021 when my grandfather died. If you are a longtime listener to the show, you might remember that spring of 2021, my brother came on the show and we talked about Reverend Jake. We talked about his life. My grandfather's kind of like a folk legend in our county. So he was born into this small farming family in upstate New York, lived on our family land. We've got about 100 acres. We're in our 6th generation. It's been a family farm. Was born there, died there, lived his entire life there. So rare now, right? Well, when he was 11 years old, his father, my great-grandfather, broke his back. And my grandfather dropped out of school at 11 years old to take over the family farm and the milk route to keep the family land, to keep the family going at 11 years old. And I will also note both of his sisters went on to finish high school and have white-collar professional careers. So he sacrificed his education for them, which I think is worth noting and incredible. He kept the family afloat while my great-grandfather healed. Mathematically and mechanically gifted, genius, incredibly intelligent and intuitive, absolute salt of the earth. He was also my first spiritual teacher. He lived into his 80s, but a lifetime of rough living meant that those last few decades he was pretty sick, and he spent the last 8 years of his life on dialysis. So in February of 2021, I bought my home in my little tiny village in upstate New York. I was moving back home after 20 years I had been gone. I'd been living in New York for about 12 years, New York City, for 12 years before I came home. And it's April of 2021. I am just leaving New York City to drive upstate to my new home to do some work on the house in preparation for my move that is coming up in May of that year. And my mother calls. And I just got out of the 5 boroughs and my phone rings and it's my mom. If you've never had someone in your life who has been on dialysis, know that it is very difficult. That person is exhausted and they feel sick all the time. He had damage to his kidneys and his lungs, and he was only supposed to live a few years when he first got put on dialysis, and then he just busted right through that prognosis. So after 8 years, he was just exhausted. And she called to tell me that he had decided to stop dialysis, and that meant that he wouldn't survive much longer. And I had bought my house thinking about moving home. I'd had this vision of what it was going to be like for me and for my family. And part of that vision was the long conversations that I wanted to have with him about philosophy and society and politics. And we didn't often agree on those things, but he probably is the person that taught me how to discuss ideas without attacking the person, which I got to say in my life has been one of the most useful social skills I have ever had. To see the person while you debate ideas. And I had so been looking forward to sitting in his like dusty, gross office and dissecting the world with him for hours and hours. And now that wasn't going to happen. So about a week, he made it about a week, and then he passed. And I spent, I can't tell you how many days after that. I just laid in bed on my laptop, binge watching The Simpsons, completely numb, just dissociated from everything. Why The Simpsons? I don't know. I have not watched them since. I played a ton of Pokemon Go for about 6 weeks. I have not played it since. Why Pokemon Go? I don't know. I think some part of my subconscious brain was like, well, walking is good for you, but you're thinking too much. So let's at least make it a game, right? Like walking will help your mental health. So thank you, subconscious. But I can tell you, right? Conscious, subconscious, individual, social, unconscious, individual, totally numb. And the point that I'm trying to make in sharing this with you is that numbing in itself is not necessarily evil and bad, and we should avoid it. It is a mechanism that our nervous system will use when we are in a state of shock and overwhelm. So after a few weeks of like The Simpsons and Pokemon Go, the fog starts to lift, and I just kind of stopped doing them as the world began to take this new shape that I didn't anticipate, the shape that without him. And I just kind of gradually was able to let go of what I thought things were going to be like and make a new future. Sometimes numbing is saving us from the things that we're not fully ready to accept or we can't fully see. And that can be really helpful. And there have been other times in my life where it has been alcohol or THC. And what I've noticed in myself is when that impulse to live that way, to cope that way, or to numb that way goes on and on and on, that's when it's a problem. Or you keep reaching back into it and it just makes you less and less effective. So the stress gets higher and higher and higher. And now you're in a downward spiral. That's what we want to avoid. That's when it gets out of hand. And if you're able to recognize that, I see that now where I'm like, okay, I have used these substances to unplug myself far too many days in a row. Probably time to get help, right? Like that's the sign that this is not working. And that things feel too fractured. So numbing in itself is not evil or bad, but it is avoidance. And sometimes that avoidance is to allow us the time to build the base to then build the coping. Sometimes you just need to unplug a little, and that's okay. But we can't live there, right? Because if we want to build well-being, we want to be effective at dealing with our challenges so that we can use our gifts to make things better, which is my value system. That's what I think all this stuff is about. I'm guessing you maybe think so too, because you're listening to this show. So I'm going to assume that that value system interests you. And then it's a question of, well, how do we do that then? So let's get to that. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall. We're talking about coping or numbing. We unpacked what they are. We unpacked the numbing stuff. Let's turn back to coping. So to me, coping is all about buffering what is happening to keep oneself high functioning so you can keep it moving, right? So you can get on through. Maybe you've encountered this thing. It's pretty common out on the interwebs or in the self-help space, yada, yada. This thing where if you've got a big goal, you got to chunk that goal down to its like bite-sized bits and just keep doing like the next thing so that you don't get overwhelmed. I think people mostly get that idea. Now, I want you to think about like our big stressors. Coping is partly so that we can chunk it down into its manageable size, right? If it's all too much, coping is how am I going to deal with me and mine so that I can like buffer it through. and keep myself emotionally resilient. And then hopefully over time, you can metabolize, you can process the emotion, you can process the problems, you can make meaning, you can integrate those lessons, and then come to a new cohesive, integrated place where you can function well. That's the goal. And I'm going to recognize, like, maybe if the stressor is big enough, your life is not going to be the same shape, right? Like losing my grandfather, my life wasn't the same shape anymore. But with effective coping and emotional skills, you learn, you grow, you move forward, you make new meaning, you make new life, make a new dream. But I think there's a question here about, like, well, then what does good coping look like? Yes, numbing sometimes is okay if there's a big enough shock, if you're too overwhelmed and you just need to, like, can't feel anything tonight, not going to demonize it. And it can get out of the bag. But what does coping actually look like? According to the Encyclopedia of Applied Psychology, not applied positive psychology, just the regular old psychology. According to the Encyclopedia of Applied Psychology, there are 5 essential coaching, let's try that sentence again, 5 types of coping skills. According to the Encyclopedia of Applied Psychology, there are 5 types of coping skills. 1, problem-based coping. 2, emotional-based coping. 3, religious or spiritual coping. 4, meaning-making. And 5 is social support. Now, when I first read these, I thought, okay, I wonder how much overlap there are on some of these. Generally, when I look at the research, the frameworks in, like, psychological constructs, what I'm looking for, I care less about what is a scientific framework and more about how do I help people with this. And when I look at this list, problem-based coping, emotional, religious or spiritual, meaning-making, and social support, to me, it feels like the spiritual one and the meaning-making one seem connected, especially since it's our spiritual experiences and transcendence that often give meaning and meaning-making. So that one kind of jumped out at me. And when I dug a bit deeper into these frameworks, one of the most common tools in the problem-based coping is social support, but that's its own category. I don't know. I found that confusing. It's okay if you do also find that confusing, because it just matters what we do with it, right? It matters what we do with these ideas. The frameworks are important for having a way to relate to the ideas, but we want to know what we do with this information. Problem-based coping is all about problem solving. What is the source of the stress? Can we get control of it through information and planning and strategizing? I think there's a lot of people who turn to this when stress gets stressing, when life gets lifing, until we encounter a problem that is significant enough that it just doesn't work anymore. So there are some problems that we cannot strategize our way out of. There are some stressors that don't have obvious solutions, or the things we can't control, or they're just going to take time and you have to walk through it. Not all problems come with easily identifiable solutions, or some problems can't be solved. So problem-based coping is useful, but it is limited. And it also, we are in a society that's so cerebral, that's so heady, that to focus exclusively on problem-based coping is to completely neglect that we're pack animals with a nervous system that feels feelings, right? So we can't just park there, even though I'm sure there are people listening to this that are problem-based copers that are like, give me a spreadsheet, give me a project plan, let's tackle this top down. Sometimes we just have to feel our feelings. And so then emotional-based coping is obviously feeling our feelings. I think it's also like doing your self-care. It is like making sure your foundational needs remain met. That's where your proactive self-care, your systems come into place, where even when you are in a stressful situation, are you still eating meals at consistent times that actually have nourishing food in them? Are you prioritizing sleep? Are you moving your body? And I know for me, I grew up in a way, and there were times in my life that it's like, no, there's too much crazy stuff going on. I don't got time for that. And what I've come to instead, mostly in my 30s, I feel like I came to this threshold of non-negotiables. What are the non-negotiables that no matter what is going sideways in my life, we're not going to compromise on eating some vegetables so my gut doesn't go sideways? Because if my tummy's all hurting, I'm going to be way less effective. I'll probably feel sick because of, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that comes with digestive stuff. I'm going to drink water. I'm going to prioritize sleep. The only exception on the sleep thing is like if somebody is in the ER, right? Like, and I got to get them to the hospital. And most of the time, for most of us, our routine stressors are not emergencies. Most of us are dealing with longer term, drawn out. This isn't a short-term problem. These are chronic problems. Stress at work, stress in the family, concern for our context. So making sure we've got that baseline of your non-negotiables when it comes to meeting your foundational human needs. And when I say foundational human needs, I mean my physical body is cared for. I'm psychologically and emotionally safe. I'm financially secure, right? Like the foundation. So emotional-based coping, doing your self-care, because you're going to be so much more effective at regulating your feelings and figuring out what's going on if you have slept and eaten and moved your body and had some water. Distracting yourself. I think that this is an interesting category of things, because if you weren't raised in a distracting yourself family, you might think, well, isn't that just like unplugging and numbing and avoiding the problem? But no. When we look at the research and the experiments on coping and stress, and some of the fun ones are in children, not that it's fun to stress out kids, but like putting kids in a situation where they have to regulate themselves, where there's going to be a reward or there's a withdrawal punishment, which is like, you can have this reward, but if you do the thing you're not supposed to do, we'll take parts of it away, right? Punishment by withdrawal. One of the most effective things that some little kids do when they're in that waiting condition, when they're stressed, is distract themselves. So if you've got something on the horizon that feels overwhelming, that feels scary, that feels bad, and it's stressing you out, distraction is a really effective way to deal with that chronic stressor. And then reframing. I mentioned cognitive behavioral techniques. One of them is reframing. I'm going to tell myself a different story. I'm going to make different meaning out of what is happening. And then, of course, there's soothing things like taking a bath, watching The Simpsons. All of these are examples of emotion-based coping, because what they're allowing you to do is cope with what's going on in you. And it doesn't have to be about something bad. I wish I had said this earlier in the episode, but I realize now, like, we got it in here. It doesn't have to always be something bad. Maybe it's a big opportunity. I recently got to go to Phoenix and record some new videos for NASM on a course that I'm working on. It's a big opportunity. I was so excited, but there was also that like trepidation. It's funny because I'm on camera for NASM every week on the show, but it was a whole room full of people I'd never worked with before. And I haven't done on-camera work like that in that way in about 3 years. And I told myself all kinds of little stories about it. But there was a huge opportunity. I just had to cope with the intensity. I'm glad to say it went well. Went well, fam. We're good. But it's practicing the regulation strategies. It's the breathing. It's the, hugging it out. It's the calling a friend. It's the scheduling other stuff to do so that you don't lose regulation, so that you can show up. So it doesn't have to be bad, because not all stress is bad. If you listen to the recent Good Stress, Bad Stress episode, you know that. Okay, so regardless of categories and labels and subconscious and conscious and individual and social and all of the different parsing out and labeling in this episode, what does healthy coping look like? I'm going to give you the quick rundown skinny tick list right now. All right. Foundation, self-care, right? What are your non-negotiables? Keeping those baseline needs met. How are you going to continue the flywheel of proactive self-care that keeps your baseline high so that you can handle a lot, right? Moving your body, drinking water, eating good food, prioritizing sleep. Those things are all about building your capacity, maintaining your fortitude. Fortitude is one of my words right now. Foundation. Second, creative outlet. To me, having some kind of creative outlet is self-affirming. What do I like to make? What do I want to do? Making it something tangible and creative. Music, art, maybe you're making it, maybe you're consuming it, doesn't matter. A creative outlet. Number 3, moving your body. Obviously, we talk about it on the show all the time. It is a foundational pillar of well-being in all of its forms. It makes us more sensitive to positive emotional experience. It releases cytokines that help with inflammation. It helps with healing. It helps with cognition. It makes us more sensitive to our own serotonin. Move your body. Number 4. So we got self-care, creative outlet, moving your body. Number 4, focusing on your controllables. We've talked in other episodes about learned helplessness, right? When we feel like we are helpless, we are in an unsolvable problem, humans become passive. If you want to bypass that helplessness, identifying some kind of tangible, controllable action, and then going and doing it. One of my absolute favorite things to do in the summer when I have something stressful going on, especially because my job is so heady, it's mostly online, mowing my lawn. I love mowing the lawn because I'm out there, I'm moving my body, I'm in the sunshine, and I have this very tangible, physical, visible thing that I can go, I did that. My lawn looks good. If nothing else happened today, my lawn looks good. So mow your lawn. That's what I'm saying. But find something controllable. This is that thing where, like, when you feel a bit depressed and then you clean your house, you feel a bit better. That is because you are moving past your passivity by having something that you control that you chose to do. You're exhibiting your agency on your environment. All right. Self-care, creativity, moving your body, controllables. 5th on the list, journaling. Why journaling? Because writing through what's going on with you, telling the story, is intentional meaning making. Meaning making is that the thing that your brain does all the time, whether you're aware of it or not, where you are filtering through the events of something and deciding what's important, what's not important, and what is the through line of the story of what is happening. You do it subconsciously, but when you sit down and journal it through, just like when you tell it to a friend, you're intentionally making meaning out of what is happening. And that's one of the ways that we cope, is by deciding what the story is. So you can do that with somebody, social coping, or you can do it by a journal, right? Individual. And that brings us, if it's done with a friend, to a soothing connection, because humans are pack animals. So this might be spending time with a friend, cuddle in your pet, cuddle in your partner if you're lucky. But having that connection, co-regulation, that mutual support, is one way that we can effectively cope. And of course, if all of these things are still ineffective, we find ourselves numbing long-term, or you just want some more help, therapy. Get a therapist. Big fan of therapy. I always think it's wild with any wellness influencer or coach or person is out there saying, oh, don't engage at all with this clinical professional. If that's happening with you, like blinking dashboard lights. And just like any other lifestyle practitioner, there are great personal trainers. There are terrible personal trainers. There are great group fitness instructors. There are terrible group fitness instructors. There are great massage therapists. There are terrible massage therapists. There are great therapists and there are terrible therapists. Just keep on at it until you find the right one. If you're going through something big enough that you need some professional help, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a big fan. Coping or numbing. I hope that the big takeaway from this episode has been that, yes, we understand them with a bit more nuance, but also that they both have their place and that there's going to be times that we become so overwhelmed by something that changes the nature of our lives that we just need to unplug long enough that we'll be able to handle it later. And there's nothing wrong with that. We don't have to demonize it. We can just recognize that it is part of the human experience and then give ourselves the grace to let ourselves walk through it. And I hope whatever stressors are happening in your life, that you find that grace and a bit of ease in it too. Of course, like any episode, I would love to hear your feedback on this episode too. You can email me. It is info@darlene.coach. My Instagram is also darlene.coach. My website is darlene.coach. And I'm available on LinkedIn. If you are a fan of the show, subscribe, follow, like, share. If you've never written us a review, please go and do, because it does help the algorithm to promote the show. Thank you so much. Take good care of yourselves and one another, and be well.